Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We are back with another episode of Daily Palantir. On today's show, we've got three main topics to discuss. Number one, Ukraine. This article came out about 2 weeks ago. We didn't get a chance to really go through it. The Times did a really big piece. I mean, one of the biggest pieces I've ever seen on Palantir's role in Ukraine. So we're going to be discussing that and why we might not be as bullish as we need to be on Palantir's relationship and future with Ukraine. Number two, Palantir got a new defense prototyping contract last week from the Defense Innovation Unit. Going to explore what that contract looks like, what it means, and what implications that could have in the future for government contracts and growth. And number three, Palantir Q1 expectations are out from Wall Street. I want to look at those estimates and give my preliminary thoughts. We still have probably a month to go until earnings. I want to give my preliminary thoughts on numbers that I think we're probably going to do well on and meet in terms of expectations, and numbers that we could possibly beat. Let's get into it. All right, so first thing I want to start off with today is this Ukraine news. I thought this was really interesting stuff. Arnie posted this article about 2 weeks ago, March 30th, or actually just a week ago, so it's actually relatively recent, where Palantir was dubbed Ukraine's secret weapon from the Times. Now, I thought this was incredibly interesting because this is an entire expose on what is going on with Ukraine and Palantir, and it's not kind of like a hit piece or anything like that. It's more so actual interviews with people who work at Palantir, like Lewis Mosley, head of Palantir UK, talking about their role in Ukraine and why they are happy and proud to be working in Ukraine. Before we get into the actual article and some of the tidbits that Arnie highlighted that I thought were really good, my overall thesis after reading this was, I don't think we are bullish enough for what's happening in Ukraine. And the reason I say this is because it's not just about Palantir being on the battlefield. It's about Palantir being an entire operating system for an entire country that, quite frankly, needs an operating system because they have to rebuild. Who knows when this war is going to end? It's coming up on more than 2 years at this point, and I would imagine that at some point the war will end and there will be some treaty or some recognition of one side acknowledging something. Like, it's going to happen eventually, I would hope. And when that does happen, there will need to be a lot of rebuilding happening. And already that rebuilding is happening right now in Ukraine. I think Palantir, based on this article, is probably going to be controlling the bulk of that rebuilding, not even just on the government side and defense side, but also on the private sector side. And I think that can be very valuable for Palantir shareholders going into the future. So a couple of quick quotes I wanted to read from here. Palantir software, which was adopted by Dominic Cummings in number 10 during the coronavirus pandemic, led to a £330 million contract being signed with the NHS. It's deceptively simple. By crunching huge amounts of data, the firm provides Ukrainian commanders with a complete view of the battlefield, from warships sailing in the Black Sea to tanks rolling across the Donbass to fighter jets launching cruise missiles from the air. So a basic explanation of what Palantir does, why their software is so important. More than 1,000 members of the Ukrainian armed forces stationed in brigade headquarters across the country are using Palantir software. So we officially have a number on the amount of people actually using their software on the battlefield. The company has half a dozen staff permanently based in Ukraine, their MacBooks adorned with stickers of Patron, Ukraine's ubiquitous mind-sniffing dog, and javelin-wielding raccoons. There's a Bletchley Park element to it. You get your best and brightest and put them in uniform in the headquarters, said Mosley. You don't want your nerds in the trenches. Mosley is the executive vice president of Palantir. This person, Lewis Mosley, was extremely instrumental in Palantir getting the NHS deal. I mean, the amount of meetings this guy probably had to go through just to, get the NHS to officially give them the contract, which is crazy. We don't even talk about that contract anymore. That was such a big deal. And now it's just yeah, we got that contract. This is someone you want to pay attention to if you are a Palantir shareholder. Reading a little bit more. Palantir software uses AI to speed up traditional military decision-making. At the heart of this is Meta Constellation, a program which allows Ukraine to build a detailed picture of what the Russians are up to. Originally developed for war on the terror, the software has learned the geography of the Ukrainian steppe and the Black Sea as intimately as it knows the landscape of Afghanistan and Iraq. That's incredibly interesting to know that that's how long the software has been there and how essentially accustomed it's become to the geography that's really rooted in the network effects of the data that it gets. The insights gleaned from the photos are then layered with additional information such as informants' tips on the movements of enemy troops or clues provided by intercepted intelligence. The resultant map of Ukraine is displayed in Gaia, a software roughly equivalent to the tabletop miniature battlefields used by the First World War generals to shut down troops, albeit in the form of a live feed on a computer screen. One more thing I wanted to just read from here. Outside of Ukraine, Palantir's octopus-like grip on multiple areas of government has been criticized by privacy campaigners, concerned on the implications to a multi-billion-dollar private company managing public data. As Kyiv runs low on ammunition, it becomes increasingly essential that every remaining shell, rocket, and missile finds its target. Mosley says victory is a precondition for justice, reconstruction, and everything else. Now, why is this so important to me? I think there's a couple of things here to analyze in the context of what's going on with Palantir. The article here says Palantir has an octopus-like grip in the context of governments and also in the context of how they're working with Ukraine. They're not just working with the Ukrainian government. We saw a couple of weeks ago, we got another partnership with Palantir extending their work with the Ministry of Defense to be able to rebuild schools. So originally they were rebuilding roads, infrastructure, things of that nature. Now they're going into the schooling the part of Ukraine and saying, hey, a lot of these schools have been ruined because of what has happened with the war. How can we find another way to get kids the education that they deserve? I think, and going even deeper to this, JP Morgan and BlackRock set up a couple $1 billion fund. I think it was like $4 or $5 billion fund back in July of 2023 to help rebuild Ukraine. That money was raised from the assumption, like these venture firms or these investment firms, they're basically looking for opportunity. And opportunity in the context of Ukraine was pretty obvious, right? Ukraine has been war-torn. If we invest money, we can start new businesses, private enterprises. JP Morgan and BlackRock can kind of seed fund all that stuff. I would imagine some of that money would be going to a company like Palantir that could provide the digital backbone and infrastructure from a data perspective to be able to get things up and running in Ukraine as well. How much money is there? I don't know. We've given Ukraine over $100 billion in the context of the U.S. government. How much of that money kind of makes its way to Palantir? I have no clue. And I really wish on the earnings call, which is probably not going to happen, but I really wish we could get some analysis of just like how much money we've gotten from Ukraine. If we got nothing, then that's fine. Like, I just want to know, right? How much money have we gotten? But when you see articles like this, it reminds you that there's probably a lot more money to be getting in the future when it comes to Ukraine. What Palantir is doing within Ukraine to me is very similar to what Palantir did in the NHS. And as an investor, I think the big thing to become better as an investor is pattern recognition. So when you're looking at something happening and you're not bullish enough or you're not bearish enough, when that same thing happens again, I mean, the stock market tends to go in one direction over time. So when these patterns tend to happen within companies that have a history of execution and exceptional management and obviously exceptional products, you can kind of draw some resources or some inferences from that. So when Palantir went into the NHS and they worked for free, and then they end up with a $480 million contract 3 years later with the NHS, I think it's very similar to what they're doing in Ukraine. They went to Ukraine, they worked for free. Now this article says they have an octopus-like grip. They're in all aspects of the battlefield and other aspects of the government in regards to doing things like rebuilding schools. So you got to ask yourself, all right, well, Ukraine's going to get a lot of money probably in the coming years, either through foreign aid or once the war is over, they're just going to decrease their expenses dramatically in terms of actually fighting in the war, which means they're going to have to allocate capital to rebuilding their country. Who's going to be getting some of the heavier contracts? We're talking about multi-hundred million, if not billion-dollar contracts to be able to help them do it. I don't know if Palantir is definitely getting those deals, but one can argue from a very, like legitimate perspective as you're looking at what the company has done in other countries. We see what Palantir is doing in Lithuania. We talked about that last week, where they got a $37 million contract, and they're probably getting their octopus-like grip into the Lithuanian government to really begin deepening their relationship. That might happen in Ukraine. And if that does happen in Ukraine, that means there's a lot of avenues for growth. There's a lot of momentum for Palantir to be able to generate significant revenues. And, the work we did for 2 years for free at a loss of probably, a couple $100 million, whatever we spent at an operating loss, that can be made back in the coming years at an aggressive pace. And that's something that I think shareholders might not be expecting. Definitely something that the street is not expecting. I think we talked about this last week as well. Germany wanting Palantir back. We talked about that on Palantir Weekly on Friday. I think NATO is going to be a really big market for Palantir. I'm just on the record. I think NATO is going to be, over the next decade, as the world becomes more geopolitically intense, in a situation where they're going to need software as the competitive moat in order to defend their sovereignty and in order to make sure that they're ready to exist in the 21st century powered by AI. And in the context of defense software, I just don't think there's that many competitors to Palantir. And we've seen with Germany, officials saying, hey, we want Palantir back. It's really hard to make it on your own. And that's what you get for investing in Palantir. That's the technology moat you're getting. Now, if they can just execute on the business side, I think NATO and the government business overall can become very, very big. Okay, speaking of the government business, Palantir got a new government contract last week that we didn't get to talk about because last week was so crazy and we had so much stuff going on. So Palantir is selected by the U.S. Army plus DIU, which is the Defense Innovation Unit. I didn't even know that was a thing, but that is a thing. They select Palantir to participate on the Ground Vehicle Autonomous Pathways GVAP project. So let's read a little bit from the press release. The U.S. Army has partnered with the DIU to prototype autonomous software and processes to adapt uncrewed vehicle technology to a range of diverse and challenging military environments. The Ground Vehicle Autonomous Pathways project will prototype software for the navigation of uncrewed vehicles by fusing data from multiple sensors and allow for teleoperations of unmanned ground vehicles. Additionally, the project will provide a technical pipeline to continue rapid modeling, testing, evaluation, development, and deployment of autonomous features as they become commercially available. One of the technical directors for the DIU says there has been a revolution in the techniques and capabilities of uncrewed ground vehicles occurring in the private sector over the past 2 decades. We're eager to bring these mature technologies back into the Department of Defense, where initial work was inspired by the DARPA Grand Challenges. Now, where does Palantir come into this? Two software system integrators, so the company's actually building the software in order to integrate all the data pipelines for this particular project, are Anduril and Palantir. So the DIU received 110 responses to be able to do this contract. They picked about 5 to 6 companies, and 2 software system integrators that were picked were Anduril and Palantir. Now, what does that mean? I don't know if that means if Anduril and Palantir are necessarily competing with each other. From a gut reading of this, I don't think they're competing. I think they're working together. They have a symbiotic relationship, the same type of relationship they had for the Titan contract. Palantir just got a $179 million 2-year Titan contract a month ago. And they're working with Anduril. Anduril is a subcontractor on that overall contract. So I think this is the same thing. Maybe Anduril is not a subcontractor here. Maybe Palantir and Anduril are working together. If it is a competition, we'll see over time. But I think the wording on this would have been a little bit more, hey, these guys are competing for this contract versus the wording that they chose. The reason I say that is because when we got the first prototype of Titan back in June of 2022, that's what this prototyping contract reminds me of. I don't know if this is going to be worth as much as Titan was worth, but we were working with Anduril competing against C3 AI and Raytheon, which we beat a month ago. That project started back in June of 2022. It seems like this is the same thing, except Palantir and Anduril are actually working together here. Now, what's really exciting about this is it just goes to show how big this government business is becoming. We just talked about in the last segment, NATO, and how large of a business that can become. Germany wants them back. Ukraine can't get enough of them. The U.S. government has a lot of money to spend, and they are deploying autonomy, AI, machine learning in a variety of different use cases, and we've seen these use cases over the past couple of months as we've covered this on the channel. I mean, I didn't even know that ground vehicle autonomous pathways for fusing data from multiple sensors for unmanned or uncrewed ground vehicles was even a thing. Like, I didn't know that was a thing that the U.S. government was working on. It's a thing that the U.S. government is working on, and obviously they're working on it for a variety of reasons. The number one reason being they want to be technologically advanced and secure in a new world powered by AI before their adversaries. And so from that perspective, if you need software to be able to integrate all of that for it to make sense, which is kind of what we've been talking about for a while on this channel as one of the bull cases for Palantir, there is not that many companies out there that are going to get the job done, especially not that many companies that have actually proved they could get the job done. Palantir getting that Titan contract proved they are the world's first, or the U.S. government's first, software prime. They beat Raytheon, which is not an easy thing to do because their software was just that much better that the U.S. government selected them over a legacy incumbent because that legacy incumbent did not have the technology that Palantir had. And Shyam Sankar said in 2022 that they want to become the world's first software prime, and they ended up becoming that for the U.S. government because this type of prime contract doesn't go to software vendors like Palantir, but it did this time. So to me, that signals a very obvious thing in regards to defense contracts, which is that Palantir is going to be able to win more of this. So this is why Mariana for Bank of America upgraded Palantir to $28 once we got the Titan contract, because to her, it's like, all right, if they got the Titan contract and the U.S. government had to go with these guys over the old guys, they're going to get more contracts, and those contracts are going to add up, which should reaccelerate the U.S. government business and the government business overall. Put in NATO, that also is starting to spend more, and we should see more of those deals come in. The government business can be very, very big for Palantir. Okay, last thing we'll talk about today, Q&A expectations from Wall Street. So Palantir Source posted this on Twitter. This is what Q1 2024 the market is expecting. Revenue, $615 million. Gross margin, 82%. Operating profit, $197. EBITDA, $202 million. Pre-tax profit, $226. Net income, adjusted net income, $189. And then GAAP net income of $83 million. So I think these numbers are relatively legit. If you look at Q4 estimates, we beat on revenue by like 5 million. We beat on gross margin. I think we came in at like 84%. So we beat on that by a couple of percentage points. Net income, we brought in like 90 million that quarter. So we beat on net income by like 20 million as well. So these expectations aren't that crazy. Top line revenue, 615, net income, 83 million. Now, what I think changes these numbers and makes it better for us is if we can beat on customer count. If we can actually beat on customer count in a significant way, I think we're going to win. If we have the boot camps that we've all been seeing scale at a broader level, that means we should add more customers. Last quarter, we added 47 customers. I don't know how many we're adding this quarter. But if we add anywhere from 50 to 60, our growth rate's going to get closer to 11% on the customer count quarter over quarter. And that means that there's going to be more top line revenue coming in because if we're getting more customers, we're going to get more revenue. Now, we might not recognize that revenue completely because, like let's say you get a new you get a new client and they work for about 3 months and then you want to sign them and they sign a pilot deal for like 60 days. Maybe we recognize some of that revenue, but not all of that revenue because it's coming later in the future because they're getting a 2-year deal, but they're still working out the details. I don't know what it's going to look like. But if we add a substantial amount of customers, which maybe it's not this quarter, maybe it's in the next coming quarters, from everything we're seeing in the boot camps, we think it can happen this quarter. Revenue should beat, and if revenue does beat, that's really good in the context of Wall Street. That also means net income can beat. Net income can beat for 2 reasons. Number one, if our adjusted operating margins start to go up, we went from 29% to 34% last quarter, which was phenomenal, and that was up 50% over 18 months from 17% in Q3 2022. So if that goes up, that means we should have theoretically more net income because the margins on the operating income are actually better, right? So more comes to the bottom line as long as our expenses are decently stable. And then if we get more customers, top line revenue should increase, which means that should also make its way down to the bottom line. We also have, I think, 3 billion and change in treasuries. So that we know we're going to guarantee $40-50 million of net income. The question is how much income can we get from the actual business itself. So customer count determines everything going to Q1. Now, my preliminary thoughts on people that I know inevitably are going to ask in the comments, hey, what is your play on earnings? I'm not making a big play on earnings, quite frankly, because I think even if we beat on customer count and we have a great quarter, the macro is a little unstable. And I think that could reasonably, pump up and then pump right back down until we get that rate cut. Until we get that rate cut, it's going to be very hard to justify a lot of some of these companies going higher if they've already moved. I mean, Palantir is already up almost 40% year to date. So could we get back to like 25? Right now we're at 23, 100%. I think that's possible. And we could sustain that. Can we inch up to 30? Yes. Are we going to sustain that? I don't know. The way we sustain it is if we blow revenue numbers out of the water. So instead of growing the 19.9% year over year the Palantir projected, maybe we grow 23% or we increase our guidance to 23, 24%. I think that changes the equation. And that would be good. Or we get a rate cut before then. We're probably not getting a rate cut before then. So the question simply becomes, how aggressively can we beat these earnings? So that's why I'm not doing an earnings play, because I don't know if it's going to be a crazy aggressive beat after we just had, a 40% move on earnings in Q4. Now, granted, we could have a 40% move again to the upside or to the downside. Probably not to the downside, but to the upside if we have a really good beat. The question is, how sustainable is that going to be in general? So I am bullish going into Q1. I think customer count is going to do well. I just think that customer count might take a couple quarters to materialize into revenue. And if that's the case, then if not in Q1, then maybe by Q3, Q4, we start to see that revenue really increase. And that's when I think it's going to get very exciting. In the context of government deals, I think government is going to accelerate or reaccelerate. I don't think we're going to recognize a ton of government revenue yet because a lot of this stuff kind of happens over time, which is reasonable. But we're definitely going to meet with the numbers that we saw on the screen. The question is, how well can we beat those? And if we beat those decently well, we should get a pop because people want Palantir shares. People care about Palantir shares. People want more exposure to Palantir. The street is starting to realize that, hey, Palantir is an AI play. And if we missed NVIDIA, we missed Microsoft, we probably should have missed Palantir. But they're going to have to show some decent growth numbers for them to sustain that beat, which I think they can do. It's just a question of if those customer count numbers hold up for Palantir. All right, that's it for me. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. DailyPalantir.substack.com, my free email newsletter every single day for Palantir. Please make sure to check it out. And I will see you guys tomorrow on the next one. Bye, everybody.